Charlotte wanted to run away from this place, from the hospital. The cry of babies caught her ears and only one thought throbbed in her head: to run away as soon as possible. "Well, Charlotte, are you still leaving your child?" her midwife, Mrs. Taylor, asked. "You heard my refusal already. Do I need to repeat 100 times?" Charlotte rudely replied, "No, it's not enough. I just suggest taking the baby in your arms, feeling baby's warmth." The midwife said softly, "Think about it. Is it worth giving up happiness?" "I will not take the baby, and don't even persuade me." Charlotte's voice became metallic. "I have nothing. No housing, no money. What do you want from me?" "Charlotte, but you probably have parents," Mrs. Taylor asked hopefully. "Yes, I have Mom, but she's an old person. I don't want to burden her with a child, and also I'm afraid that she will be labeled as a bitch's mother," Charlotte said with a temper. "That's so funny. You want to destroy the life of a child only because you're afraid of people's rumors? Everything will be forgotten over time, and you will raise and educate your little blood. Think, Charlotte. You run the risk of greatly regretting what you're going to do." Mrs. Taylor looked straight at Charlotte. The young girl lowered her head. "But I don't have money, not at all. I don't even have any money to go home," Charlotte sighed. "Don't worry about it. We will collect the dowry and money. I'll personally buy you a ticket, wherever you say. What will you name your daughter?" Mrs. Taylor smiled. Josephine, just like my mother," Charlotte answered. "A wonderful name," Mrs. Taylor agreed. "You should feed her while I pack everything for you." She went out. Charlotte, childishly awkward, took her daughter, trying to feed her. On the doorstep, Mrs. Taylor ran into a doctor who looked in amazement at the midwife. "Did she finally change your mind?" she asked incredulously. "Will she take your daughter?" Please, Mrs. Taylor nodded. Charlotte withdrew her refusal. The power of Mrs. Taylor's persuasion has such a strong effect on her. As the midwife promised, she packed everything Charlotte needed for Josephine. The midwife bought a Charlotte ticket, and she gave some money to her. Charlotte herself no longer believed that in the morning she wanted to leave her little miracle in maternity hospital. "Thank you, Mrs. Taylor, for avoiding me to sin. I'm so ashamed in front of you." Charlotte lowered her eyes. "You did the right thing, Charlotte. Don't beat yourself up for mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The main thing is to believe. There will always be light at the end of the tunnel," the kind midwife admonished Charlotte. Charlotte listened to her with a bated breath. "I once made a mistake too, but I couldn't change anything. I was then a very young girl. I became pregnant, but I had nowhere to live as I was an orphan. A long term of pregnancy didn't allow me to have an abortion, and I went to my grandma. So bottom line, I will never be able to have children again." Mrs. Taylor smiled sadly. "And when I got married, I didn't have long marriage. The husband didn't want to live with such a dummy who couldn't give him us, and I was left all alone." Charlotte looked at her with sympathy. Soon her landing was announced. "Charlotte, don't forget me. Here's the phone number and address. You call or write me, okay?" Mrs. Taylor shouted after departing Charlotte. "Sure!" Charlotte waved her hand and boarded the train. She drove all night and arrived at the station in the morning. Then there was a difficult pass to the village with Josephine in her hands and with a backpack on her shoulders. On the way, Charlotte was very worried about the way her mother would react to her arrival. On the way, she met a neighbor, Mrs. Robinson. "Hello, Mrs. Robinson. How is my mom doing there?" Charlotte kindly asked her. "Oh, look at what the cat dragged in. She's in the ground like half a year already. And it's right that she lies there, otherwise she wouldn't have endured such a shame." The old woman pointed her finger at a small bundle that Charlotte carefully held in her hands. "This is not a shame, but my happiness," Charlotte answered proudly. Then she entered her yard. There she sat down on a bench and sobbed. She felt sorry for everyone, your mother, herself, your daughter. Josephine also felt your mother's sadness being capricious. You have to be strong for the sake of your daughter, Charlotte said to herself and entered the house. 10 years have passed. It was Christmas time, the most long-awaited family holiday. Charlotte busied herself at the festive table. Josephine looked out of the window with interest at the disk of the yellow moon. Where's my grandmother? She suddenly asked her mother. On the moon, dear. Charlotte didn't know what else to answer. Oh, it's a pity. If she just were with us, she would give gifts. All the girls in our class are given gifts by their grandmas. Charlotte sighed. Where is my second grandma? After all, there are always two grandmas, right? Two grandmas, your mother echoed. She rushed to the box with Mrs. Taylor's address and phone number, but there was no piece of paper. It's okay, Josephine. Tomorrow we will definitely go to the second grandma, resolutely said Charlotte. She and Josephine arrived at the city early in the morning. They immediately went to the hospital, where a kind midwife worked. At the reception, they were told that Mrs. Taylor had retired about a month ago. Charlotte decided to play her niece, saying that she and her daughter came from afar. She asked for an address. She played so convincingly that she was given Mrs. Taylor's home address. And now Charlotte rings the midwife's doorbell. It was opened by an elderly woman, and of course she didn't recognize Charlotte. Mrs. Taylor, don't you recognize me? Charlotte asked with a smile. Mrs. Taylor's face brightened instantly, and she exclaimed, Charlotte, is that you? Yes, Mrs. Taylor, this is me, and this is my daughter Josephine. Yes, Josephine, I remember. Come on in. Are you my grandma? Josephine asked the stranger directly. Can I call you grandma? Of course, my dear. The woman perked up. She was delighted, inviting the guests into the room, where there was already a decorated Christmas tree. There was a round table in the middle of the spacious room. There wasn't much furniture, but the room was cozy and bright. All evening, the women were talking at the table about their lives. Josephine, having settled down on the sofa, fell asleep. At the end of the conversation, Mrs. Taylor invited Josephine and Charlotte to stay with her. I'm all alone, Charlotte. I will help you, and you will not leave me in difficult times. Let's get Josephine into a good school and live happily ever after. Mrs. Taylor, you would better move in with us. We have a spacious house. There is enough space for everyone. But you have a one-room apartment in a stuffy city, whereas we have a river, fields, space. In the summer, we will swim, go for berries and mushrooms, and in the winter, we will go sledding, sculpt snowmen. We have such a beauty and fresh air. But the truth is better in the countryside. I don't have to look for a job. I will do more housework. And if something, I can go to the local hospital to work as midwife. At leisure time, we will get chickens, ducks, geese. And I also like to grow flowers. We will have a beautiful flower garden in the yard, Mrs. Taylor dreamed. And the garden, there is enough space for everything. Well, fine. We will always celebrate Christmas and we will live together. Josephine will be very happy. And we will get chickens and ducks and we will plant flowers, whatever your heart desires. We have everything. We have enough space. They had very cheerful holidays with gifts, jokes, and dances. After a couple of days, they began to pack up for the road. Mrs. Taylor decided to go light for the beginning to get comfortable. Later, I will order a car and transport all the necessary things. I will lease out my apartment here. So, are you really my grandma? Will you live with us? Josephine threw herself on the neck of Mrs. Taylor. Hooray! Mommy, I have a real grandma! And I always wanted such a granddaughter, Mrs. Taylor exclaimed happily. Each of the women received your own happiness. Josephine now has a grandmom who will give her gifts and feed her with delicious jam pies. Mrs. Taylor will have a family, a daughter and granddaughter who will always help in difficult times. And Charlotte thought that she and her daughter were no longer alone, that there would be always a person nearby who could be relied upon.